One very important theme in our class is the development of American political thought. And the reason that it is so important is that you need to understand, to be a well-informed citizen, you really do need to understand that a lot of these principles involving democracy, self-governance, republicanism, freedom, opportunity, however open-ended, however specific you want to be, these trace their roots. They get their origins much, much earlier in American history than most people probably believe. And today what we're going to do is discuss two issues that are really going to be instrumental in the development of American political thought and the origins of what many of us take for granted when it comes to the way that our government works. So I want to start this conversation in what historians refer to as the Enlightenment. We've talked about the Renaissance. I had described the Renaissance as the rebirth of arts in Europe. Think of the Enlightenment as the rebirth of learning. Keep in mind, guys, when Rome fell and the Middle Ages descended across Europe, people really weren't exactly concerned with learning and reading and literacy and things of that variety. They were interested in how do I survive from day one until day two. You can appreciate why they might think like that. But as the clouds began to part in Europe and things became more and more stable, life got a little bit easier. What people begin to rediscover, some of those ancient Greco-Roman works that had been locked away in libraries for the better part of 1,000 years. And ultimately what this does is inspires philosophers to really start putting forward ideas that challenge the way that things had worked, had been governed, very broadly defined, up until that point. A good example would be modern astronomy. For decades, the Catholic Church had insisted that the earth was the center of the universe. If God made man in his image, then why would it not be? And people like Copernicus and Galileo demonstrated that was in fact not the case. You see this in mathematics. You see Sir Isaac Newton that developed some theories that ultimately emerge into what you call calculus, develops the notions of gravity, things of that variety. But there's a social science element to this as well. It's not just the pure sciences or the math or anything like that. You also see social scientists, people like political philosophers, historians, political scientists, people of that variety, they get in on this act as well. The person that I need you to focus on very directly, we've touched upon him and will continue to touch upon him in this class, is the English political philosopher John Locke. Now, I just can't tell you how important John Locke is to the development of American political thought. Hugely influential in the American colonies, with who would become known as the Founding Fathers. People like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, the guy that you see at the bottom of the screen right there, Benjamin Franklin. They used to walk around with a little pamphlet that Locke had wrote, and he becomes very, very, very influential in the coming of the American Revolution. If you don't write anything else down next to John Locke's name, I need you to understand that it's going to be Locke that will develop this idea that government gets its power from the people. It's not the other way around. The only form of legitimate government, according to Locke and his writings, was a form of government where the people, the citizens, if you will, they consent to be governed. They give up their right to exist in a state of nature, and they entrust those rights into the hands of the government, and they essentially consent to be ruled. So any form of government that does not have its consent from the citizenry is an illegitimate form of government. That should sound very familiar, and as you might guess, it's going to have a really profound impact on American political thought. Now, certainly, Locke is not the only Enlightenment philosopher. You've got Rousseau, and you've got Voltaire, and you've got many others. We don't need to name them. But certainly he's going to be the most important because of his influence on the colonies. Everybody that I just referenced, they're all Europeans. And that's probably pretty par for the course. But because this is an American history class, I want you to have some perspective on an American representation of the Enlightenment, and that would, in fact, be Benjamin Franklin. Franklin was a native New Englander. A lot of people associate the modern day city of Philadelphia with Ben Franklin, and there's a reason for that. We'll talk about that in a minute. But he grew up in New England. And if you remember what New England's like, it's settled by Puritans. They're very concerned with reforming the Church of England. They're really, really concerned with religiosity, generally speaking. And there were laws that Franklin didn't exactly agree with. One, probably most famous, that you had to be in church on Sunday, and they would have people coming around house by house, making sure that everybody's family was where they were supposed to be. And if you weren't there, you would be fined. Franklin found this to be not only oppressive, but simply intolerable. He was a free thinker. I'm not saying that he was good for this or bad for this or anything. I'm just simply saying he was a very independent thinker. This is what prompts him to flee his native New England and ultimately take root in Philadelphia. And that's how and why we really kind of associate the city of Philadelphia with Benjamin Franklin. But there's a reason why I want you to understand that he's the American representation of the Enlightenment here in the colonies. What most people will associate Franklin's name with when it comes to scientific accomplishments would be that image that you're looking at there on the slide entitled "The Enlightenment and Its Impact." It's the Great Kite Experiment. Franklin had a idea, a theory, that what lightning in fact was electricity. Now you and I take that for granted, but keep in mind that we're talking about the 18th century. Anyway, coming from his Puritan New England background, Puritan ministers, probably most famously Cotton Mather, Reverend Cotton Mather, proclaimed lightning to be God's wrath. If you recall, the Puritans believed that God interacted in human affairs very, very directly, and if lightning struck a house, clearly that was an indictment on the way that family was living their lives, or maybe not living their lives. Franklin, to be quite honest, found this to be not only implausible, but a little bit ridiculous. The problem was, it's going to take more than a very strong opinion to demonstrate that lightning is in fact electricity. So what he does with this kite experiment is he allegedly flies this kite in a lightning storm. And if you look carefully on that image there, the bottom of that image, look right by that guy who's looking up at Franklin. He's got his hand out. If you look at that guy's hand, you'll see that there's a metal key attached to that kite. And if you know anything about electricity, if you happen to be an electrician, you'll certainly be able to tell us that metal, in particular things like aluminum, copper, gold, they conduct electricity. You can control, or better yet, channel the flow of electrons, which at the end of the day, that's exactly what electricity is. I have a theory, and my theory is that Ben Franklin didn't hold the kite. He probably got himself a useful idiot to do this for him. And the reason that he did this is I think he had an idea. He would probably get a little bit of a jolt. I think he thought it was pretty safe that it wouldn't kill this person, but he certainly didn't want to be the one that found that out the hard way. So that's just my theory for however little that is worth. More importantly, by demonstrating that what lightning actually is electricity and not God's wrath, what Franklin's kite experiment is going to do is it's really going to introduce a more secular element to colonial society. This explanation of the world around us, lightning storms, tsunamis, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc., Franklin believed that they could be explained by using the laws of nature. This was not God interacting directly in human affairs. And so that's what I mean when I say he introduced a secular, a non-religious element to colonial life. Another individual that will really push a secular sort of image in colonial life is a guy that you're looking at right there, Thomas Jefferson. Um, we often have this idea that America was founded by these religious exiles, and what they were interested in was religious freedom, and in particular Christian religious freedom. The fact of the matter is, there's a lot of people that colonize the North American continent, a lot of religious diversity, and of course, they don't just mean Christian diversity. If you've taken a look at that video lecture that discusses the Dutch middle colonies, you'll know that there were Jews in the early days as well. So it's not simply, a Christian variety. But Thomas Jefferson is what we call a deist. And what deism was, I guess for lack of a better way of putting it, was a spiritual movement that emphasized that reason and logic could explain the world. It wasn't the world, that is, was not created. There was no divine being, or maybe there was a divine being, but it certainly wasn't some old man in the clouds that interacted in human affairs like many Puritan ministers would have you believe. Another controversial belief within the deist system was the idea that human beings were born good. Now, if you happen to be a Christian, you'll know that one thing that you're supposed to do, at least before you die, is have a baptism. And the reason that you need a baptism is because, as the Christians believe, human beings are not born good, they're born with original sin. And so as you can see, as you might be able to guess, deism is going to fly directly into the face of this religious tradition in the American colonies. The Puritan Church in New England, you could make a case for the Catholic Church in Maryland, and even the Anglican Church in places like Virginia. It's going to pose a direct challenge to American religiosity. Quick story. Thomas Jefferson, a very practicing deist, had this habit, something that he enjoyed doing, and that was reading the Bible, reading his Bible. And every time he got to what a Christian might refer to as a miracle, something that he believed could not be explained through science, logic, or reason, he would take out his penknife and he would cut that little segment out of his Bible. And so you might be able to guess that by the time that he got to that back cover of his Bible, what he had, I'm not trying to be cute, but was a holy Bible, right? It literally was holy from all of the things that he had cut out of it. Again, I'm not trying to be funny, but in any case, the essence of faith, whether it's Christian or otherwise, is you have it or you don't, and the deists didn't necessarily always have it. Again, they acknowledged that there probably was a higher power than mankind, but it probably didn't look the way that the establishment religions were portraying it on Sunday. Speaking of what's going on Sunday, around about the same time, the early 1700s, there's a movement that is not indigenous to the United States, or what would become the United States. It's going to start in Europe, in particular Central Europe, Germany. It's going to become known as Pietism. Now, Pietism is a really important part. I would say it's every bit as big of an important part as the Enlightenment when it comes to American political thought. Not many people get the mileage that they probably could out of Pietism. But simply put, what Pietism emphasized was that you didn't have to be born into, your position within the church. You didn't have to be a pope. You didn't need to be a bishop. You didn't need to be a minister even. You didn't have to be ordained. You didn't have to read Greek or Latin or both. All you really needed was an open heart and an open mind. And you too, little old you, insignificant you, could have a relationship with your Creator. Pietism emphasized that God cared about all people, not just the rich and powerful, and that all people could have an impression on what the Bible meant. All people could have a relationship with their Creator. Now keep in mind the kinds of religion that really thrived in the early colonial days, things that really did emphasize power and authority. The Puritan Church was pretty clear when it comes to who it felt was in charge. Same thing with the Anglican Church. I mean, the whole purpose of the Anglican Church was to consolidate power uh, through the king being the head of the state as well as the head of the church at the same time. Maybe the best way that I have to describe Pietism, and this is certainly worth writing down, Pietism was a more democratic form of government, and I mean democratic with a small d. I don't mean the Democratic Party. I mean more equal opportunity democratic, more self-discretion, decision-making ability democratic. That's what Pietism was, a more small d democratic form of religion. How did it get here? It got here through immigrants, people of religious convictions, many of them ministers, people like Jacob Freelandhusen, who is really going to plant the seed of Pietism in the American colonies, and it is going to explode and it's going to spread like wildfire. Eventually, you get a guy by the name of Jonathan Edwards, who is a preacher, he's a minister, but I would say he's more of a philosopher than he is anything else. Many of his sermons are going to become very, very famous, and probably his most famous one, the one that he gave in 1741, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. I'm willing to bet that you have heard of that, regardless of your specific religiosity, even if you have one. But the core concept of it is pretty clear. There is a higher power, and that higher power is almighty, and that higher power has the potential, has the capacity to do what it or he or she or they please with you, right? Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God emphasize that hell was a real place. It starts out by describing this hand that is dangling a spider over an open flame of a candle. And if you think about it, that hand can do virtually whatever he wants with that spider. He can roast the spider, he can slam it to the ground, he can torment the spider. Clearly, the hand is God, the spider is us, and the flame is eternal damnation. Well, when Edwards began preaching this brand of ministry, it was absolutely electrifying. And people would show up far and wide, and it would have a huge, huge influence on not only religiosity, but political culture as well. And nobody understood that better than the minister, a guy by the name of George Whitefield. What George Whitefield's going to do is take the approach, the brand of preaching that is originated by Jonathan Edwards, and he's going to conduct a series of spiritual revivals that will become known as the Great Awakening. Now, I want you to understand that these spiritual revivals swept up and down the Atlantic coast. It was not simply in the south or even the north. This is the colonies taken collectively, okay? At these religious revivals, people were said to be speaking in these languages that were indecipherable to people that had never heard them before. Many people thought that them just babbling, but what the ministers, including Whitefield, said is that they were speaking in tongues. Some people would pass out. They just simply could not handle the electric environment of these revivals, and Whitefield said they had been touched by the Spirit. Probably the most important observation that I can make to that end is whether God is using you to converse through this unfamiliar language or touching you in particular. It's a direct involvement in human affairs. Some of these groups that would form these separatist churches, breakaway churches, I'll give you a couple examples here in a minute, they felt that their miracles, number one, were very real, and number two, God might be able to poke through the invisible wall, if you will, and not only intervene in human affairs, but if one prayed for it, and lived through the holy life, the supernatural spiritual activity could become a reality, and God would directly intervene in human affairs. One of the things that you begin to see are not only these breakaway churches, people of the Presbyterian variety, people of what would later become called the Baptist variety. But to establish themselves really on a legitimate footing, they're gonna found these centers of religious um, learning. Now, if you know anything about European history, you'll know that those world famous universities, Oxford, Bologna, Paris, basically they get their start as Latin schools. That's where priests go to be trained, and Harvard, Yale, Princeton, three of the oldest academic institutions in the American tradition, ultimately started out their lives as religious learning centers. It's a place that one would go to more or less study doctrine and prepare for life in the ministry. What I want you to understand, though, is that these religious centers and these breakaway churches, Presbyterianism, for example, they loosened the grip of the Puritan church in the North. Keep in mind, in the Northeast, that was the institution. Certainly it was when it comes to the institution of power. And these new churches not only diversified religiosity, they meant that the Puritan church was no longer the only game in town. And by emphasizing um, discretion and a more democratic form of religion, I'm not going to say that it marginalizes the Puritans, but it certainly loosens their grips. I guess it's probably also fair to say that not everybody was drinking this Kool-Aid, so to speak. If you were an old light, you were a person that didn't exactly believe in what was going on in these religious revivals, the Great Awakening. If you were a new light, you very much did believe in them. So there's some diversity of thought, and ultimately this has led to conflict in this particular realm of American history. Now, the religious upheaval in the South is probably even more important. One of the reasons, very, very directly, would be the establishment of the Baptist Church. The Baptists are going to emphasize, probably most fundamentally, the Golden Rule. The idea that you ought to treat others the way that you would like to be treated. That to them really was the essence of becoming a follower of Christ. To love your enemy, that sort of thing. Think about the South for a minute. Is there a practice? Is there an institution? Is there an economic interest that might not exactly sit too well with? And I'm willing to bet right now what you're probably thinking of is slavery. Yeah, I mean, slavery kind of completely and, plainly contradicts the very notion of the Golden Rule, treating people the way that you want to be treated. So the Baptists are ultimately going to be a controversial group in and of themselves, but what really gets them in trouble is their invitation to the African and African American varieties to worship alongside white Baptists. Preaching the Golden Rule was one thing. Poor white people with enslaved black people doing it under one roof, that was a completely different situation, and very obviously it challenges not only the religious status quo, it challenges the social, the political, and the economic status quo, the business as usual sort of structure. And naturally, what the Anglican Church, the Anglican leaders throughout the South, Virginia, Maryland, North, South Carolina, what they did is they pretty much shut down the Baptist churches, that this is illegal and you can't do it. But by shutting them down, they actually made them more popular. And what you see is the Baptist church spreading rapidly all across the South. And if you travel through the South today, I mean, urban centers, rural parts of it, the old Southwest, Mississippi, Alabama, the old Southeast, Georgia, South Carolina, the Baptist church is a really big force to be reckoned with in that part of the country. The Baptist church, generally speaking, is one of the largest religious denominations in the United States as we speak. But obviously, this does not do what the establishment, the slavery establishment, wants and needs it to do. So what's going to happen is Southern Baptists are going to find a way to accommodate the Baptist church and the teachings of the Baptist church with their own economic bottom line. They're going to use the Bible to defend slavery. The fact that it existed in the Old Testament. A lot of people will point to that and say, well, if it's good for them, then it's good for us. Some people would get even more creative, and they would say that what slavery did for the African American race was lift them out of their um, so-called natural barbaric state and expose them to the virtues of high Christian living. And it was the Baptist Church that was doing that, and indirectly it was slavery that was exposing them to this great Christian religion and refining them, so to speak, lifting their standard of living, if you will. I know that sounds very ridiculous to me and you, but as you're going to find out, the church was deeply involved in politics throughout the 19th century, most of the 19th century actually. It was in the North, it is in the South, and in many cases, both North and South, a lot of this has to do with slavery. Um, Maintaining the status quo was important to the slavery powers that be. Many of them, as you've just seen here, many of them are doing that through the use of American religiosity. So as you can see, as we're summing up and concluding here, there's, I guess you could say, progressive things when it comes to this Great Awakening, in the sense that it's loosening the grip of institutions that had implemented control really from the beginning of European contact in North America, and it's giving rise to some not good things. It's being used as an excuse to continue and to perpetuate the institution of slavery. This is not going to be the last time that we talk about these religious revivals, let alone their impact on America.